Greenwich, Connecticut, December 25th. A woman is losing her future. The silver on the dining table reflects the candlelight like polished bone, but there are no ghosts here, only the family who betrayed me. I, Vanessa Nixon, sit in the silence of a stolen inheritance while the winter wind screams against the glass. They say blood is thicker than water, but my father just traded mine for 50 feet of fiberglass. My $100,000 $1,000 trust is gone, sacrificed for a brother's vanity. How long can a lie stay afloat before the debt pulls it under? I have the note. I am waiting for 8 o'clock. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The wind came off the Long Island Sound and hit the house hard. It was a dry, biting wind that rattled the heavy sashes of the windows. Inside, the air smelled of roasting turkey and expensive pine. The heat was turned up high, but I still felt the chill from the glass. My mother Diane stood by the sideboard. She was polishing the silver. She had been polishing the same 3 platters since noon. The silver was old and heavy. It was the kind of silver that stayed in families that cared about how things looked from the street. She didn't look at me when I walked into the dining room. I was wearing a gray wool sweater. It was a good sweater, plain and functional. I had bought it with my own money 3 years ago. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace and watched the flames. They were orange and blue and did not make a sound. My father Arthur was in his study. I could hear the murmur of the television. He was watching the financial news. He always watched the news until it was time to eat. He liked to know where the world was going so he could make sure he wasn't left behind. Julian arrived at 6. The front door opened and the cold air rushed in, pushing against the warmth of the foyer. He was loud. He was always loud. He smelled of the cold and of gin. He was wearing a navy blazer with a gold crest on the pocket. He looked like the kind of man who spent his life on the water even though he hadn't worked a day since he left college. He hugged Diane and she smiled for the first time all day. She loved the smell of gin on him, because it reminded her of the parties they used to throw before the money got tight. He looked at me and nodded. He didn't offer a hug. Julian was the prince, and I was the girl who stayed in the city and worked. We went into the dining room. The table was set with the silver Diane had been polishing. The candles were tall and white. Arthur came out of the study. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. He stood at the head of the table and picked up the carving knife. He began to slice the turkey. His movements were slow and precise. He did not miss a joint. He did not tear the meat. He was a man who understood the value of a clean cut. We sat down. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the clink of forks against china. Arthur poured the wine. It was a dry white wine, very cold. We talked about the things we always talked about. We talked about the neighbors and the country club and the price of heating the house. We did not talk about my job. We did not talk about the fact that I had just closed a 6-figure acquisition for my firm. Those things were not optics. They were just work. Julian started talking about his vision. He used that word a lot. Vision. He said a man in his position needed a platform. He said the world was changing, and you had to be where the people were. He meant the elite. He meant the people with the power to make phone calls that changed things. He talked about the yacht he had been looking at in Rhode Island, the Golden Fleece. He said the name like it was a holy thing. Diane nodded and reached across the table to touch his hand. She told him he had the spirit of a winner. Arthur stayed quiet. He kept eating. He chewed his food thoroughly. The conversation turned to the future. That was when Arthur put his fork down. The sound of the silver hitting the plate was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He looked at me. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was explaining a simple math problem. He told me that they had made a decision. He said they had looked at the family assets, and they had looked at the needs of the family as a whole. He said the $100,000 $1,000 trust, the money my grandfather had left for my life start, the money I had planned to use for my master's degree, and a down payment on a home was gone. He said it so casually that I thought I had misheard him. I asked him what he meant. He took a sip of his wine. He said they had used the capital to secure the Golden Fleece for Julian. He said Julian needed it more. He said the yacht wasn't just a boat, it was a business tool. He said it was an investment in the family's social standing. Julian didn't look at me. He looked at the turkey on his plate. He looked proud. I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the wind. I asked about my education. I asked about the plan we had made when I was 21. Diane spoke up then. Her voice was thin and sweet. She told me that education was often wasted on women who were already successful in their own quiet way. She said I was practical. She said I was resilient. She said I didn't need the flash that Julian needed. Arthur nodded. He leaned forward and told me that trade school was a very respectable option for someone with my sensibilities. He said the world always needed people who knew how to fix things and work with their hands. He said it would give me a real skill. He said Julian needed to look the part of a winner because in America looking like a winner was half the battle. They spoke about my life as if I weren't sitting there. They spoke about my future as if it were a small, unimportant thing they had traded for something shiny and new. The betrayal was complete. It sat on the table between the cranberry sauce and the gravy. I looked at the silver platters. They were bright and reflected the candlelight. I looked at Julian's blazer. I looked at the way my father held his wine glass. They thought they had taken everything. They thought they had moved the pieces on the board, and I was the piece that had been captured. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. Hemingway would have liked the way I sat there. I was a professional. I knew how to wait. I knew how to look at a person and see exactly what they owed. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone. It was heavy and solid. I thought about the files I had been reading for the last 3 weeks. I thought about the bridge loan Julian had signed with a private lender in the city. I thought about the Insecurity Clause that allowed a note holder to call in a debt if the borrower's financial position changed. I had worked very hard to become that note holder. I took a bite of the turkey. It was dry. It tasted like nothing. I looked at my family and I realized they were not a family. They were just people sharing a meal in a house that was too cold. I waited for the clock in the hall to strike 8. The exposition was over. The game was beginning. Julian laughed then. It was a sound that belonged in a mahogany-paneled club full of self-assurance and the assumption that the world would always provide a soft place for him to land. He leaned back in his chair, his blazer stretching across his shoulders, and looked at me with a pity that felt like a physical weight. He told the table that every fleet needed a hierarchy. He said he would be the one steering the Golden Fleece into the deep water, while I could be the tugboat that kept the harbor safe. He thought it was a very clever thing to say. My mother smiled and touched the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. She said it was a wonderful idea. She suggested that I could spend my weekends in Rhode Island, helping him get the vessel ready for the spring season. She said I had a good eye for detail, and that scrubbing the teak decks and polishing the brass would be a fine way for me to stay involved with the family's new venture. She called it an opportunity to learn the ropes of the maritime world. They both looked at me, waiting for a thank you or a nod of agreement. I did not give them one. I took a sip of the wine. It was cold and clean, and tasted of the earth. I thought about the way the wind was hitting the house and how the structure groaned under the pressure. I felt that same pressure, but I did not groan. I sat still. Hemingway wrote about the dignity of a man under pressure, and I wondered if he had ever considered the dignity of a woman who was being stripped of her future by people who claimed to love her. I didn't cry because crying didn't change the terms of a contract. I didn't argue because my father had already closed his mind, and an enclosed mind is a fortress you cannot take by storm. I looked at the fire and let my mind go back to the city. For 5 years I had lived in a small apartment in Queens that smelled of old brick and subway dust. I hadn't told them about the promotion or the bonuses. I hadn't told them because I knew that in this house, my success would only be seen as a resource to be harvested for Julian's failures. I had spent those years working for a firm that specialized in distressed asset acquisition. It was a hard business. It was a business of finding people who had overextended themselves and buying the ground out from under them. I had learned how to read a balance sheet the way a hunter reads tracks in the snow. I had learned that people like my brother always left a trail of debt because they believed their name was enough to satisfy a lender. 2 years ago, I realized I didn't need the trust money to survive. I had built my own wealth in the dark away from their eyes. I treated the $100, $1,000 as a symbol of the old guard promise, a safety net that I would never have to touch, but one that represented my place in the lineage. Now that symbol had been traded for a hull and a motor. It was a theft of respect, not just currency. I remembered the night I found out Julian was looking for a bridge loan. He had gone to a private lender I knew well, a man who dealt in high-interest short-term notes for men with big dreams and small bank accounts. Julian had put up his future interest in the family estate as collateral. He was gambling with a hand he didn't even hold yet. I had watched him do it from a distance through the digital flicker of credit reports and lien filings. I had stayed quiet. I had worked 80-hour weeks drinking black coffee that was always too hot and eating meals from paper bags, all so I could accumulate the capital necessary to move when the time was right. I was the new American resilience. I didn't inherit my life, I carved it out of the rock of the city. The cultural conflict was a physical thing in the room. My parents were the old guard, obsessed with the optics of success and the preservation of a status that was rotting from the inside. They believed in the hierarchy of the family, where the son was the sun and the daughter was a planet meant to reflect his light. They valued the appearance of a yacht over the reality of a daughter's ambition. I represented something they didn't understand, a quiet, lethal meritocracy. I didn't need a blazer with a crest to feel powerful. I felt powerful because I understood the law and I understood the flow of money. I looked at Arthur. He was talking about the tax advantages of the yacht's registration. He didn't know that I had spent the last 3 weeks working with a shell company I had established called Siren Holdings. I had approached Julian's lender when I saw that he had missed his first good faith payment on the bridge loan. The lender was nervous. He wanted out of the deal. I had bought that promissory note for 80 cents on the dollar. I held the paper. I owned the debt that allowed Julian to walk onto that boat and feel like a king. The irony was as thick as the gravy on my plate. They thought they had sacrificed my future for Julian's platform, but all they had done was hand me the leash. Julian started talking about the first party he would host on the Golden Fleece. He said he would invite the Brooks family and the Whitmores. He said it was important for the family to be seen with the right people again. "Vanessa," he said, pointing a fork at me. "You can help Diane with the catering. You always were good at organizing the small things." He laughed again. It was a wet, heavy sound. My mother joined in. She said I had a practical soul. I thought about the word practical. To them it meant someone who serves. To me it meant someone who wins. I felt a strange sense of peace. The humiliation didn't burn anymore. It only sharpened the edge of my resolve. I was the one who was culturally grounded in the reality of the world. They were living in a dream built on my grandfather's ghost. I was living in a world built on my own labor. The American value of personal freedom isn't something you are given at birth. It is something you buy with your own sweat and your own silence. I had paid for mine. Now I was going to collect the interest. I took my phone out of my pocket and placed it on the white tablecloth. It looked out of place next to the silver and the crystal. It was a black slab of glass and metal. It was a tool of the new world. I looked at the time. It was 7:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, the grace period for the Insecurity Clause in Julian's contract would expire. This clause was a beautiful piece of legal engineering. It stated that if the lender had a reasonable belief that the borrower's financial position had deteriorated, or if the borrower showed signs of bad faith, the entire balance could be called due immediately. By using my trust money for the down payment and failing to disclose his other debts, Julian had committed a technical fraud. I had the evidence. I had the power. I watched the seconds tick by on the screen. The light from the phone cast a blue glow on my hand. My father noticed the phone. He frowned. He said that phones were not permitted at the Christmas dinner table. He said it was a matter of tradition and respect. I didn't move it. I told him that tonight, tradition was going to have to make room for reality. He started to say something, a lecture about manners and the way a Nixon woman should behave, but I wasn't listening. I was listening to the wind. It was howling now, a long, mournful sound that seemed to be searching for a way into the house. I thought about the Golden Fleece sitting in the dark harbor in Rhode Island. It was a beautiful boat. It would look very good when I sold it to a man who actually knew how to sail. The dinner continued in a strained silence. The air in the room felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. Julian was still talking, but his voice had lost some of its energy. He was sensing the shift, even if he didn't know what it was. He kept looking at me, then at the phone, then back at his wine. He was a man who lived on the surface of things, and the surface was starting to ripple. I thought about the resilience I had developed. It was the resilience of the immigrant and the worker, the people who know that nothing is guaranteed and everything is earned. My parents had forgotten that. They thought the world owed them a yacht and a legacy. They thought they could take from me because I was quiet. They didn't realize that in the modern world, the quietest person in the room is often the one who owns the room. At 7:55 p.m., I saw a notification flash on my screen. It was a text from my attorney. All documents filed. Siren Holdings is the sole note holder, standing by. I felt a thrill of cold electricity run down my spine. I was 28 years old, and I was about to dismantle the hierarchy of my childhood. I looked at my mother. She was talking about the flowers for the yacht's christening. She wanted white lilies and blue hydrangeas. I thought about how the salt water would feel when the repo crew arrived. It would be cold. It would be very cold. I leaned back and waited for 8:00 p.m. I was the tugboat, and it was time to pull the big ship into the rocks. The clock in the hallway struck 8. It was a heavy sound, the kind of chime that felt like it was counting down more than just the hours. The last vibration was still hanging in the air when the landline phone on the sideboard began to ring. It was a sharp electronic trill that didn't belong in a room full of candlelight and heirlooms. My father froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. He looked at the phone as if it were an intruder. No one called the landline at 8 o'clock on Christmas night unless it was an emergency or a mistake. He set his glass down. The base of the crystal clicked against the wood. He looked at Julian, then at me, and then he stood up. He walked to the sideboard and picked up the receiver. His voice was stiff and full of the authority he thought he still possessed. He said hello. He listened for a moment, his brow furrowed, and then he handed the phone to Julian. He said it was a man named Henderson calling about the emergency contact number for the vessel. Julian's face went pale, then a mottled red. He took the phone with a hand that shook just enough for me to see the tremor. He started talking before the man on the other end could finish a sentence. He was loud. He was indignant. He asked if the man knew what day it was. He asked if the man knew whose house he was calling. He shouted about the deposit and the prestige of the Nixon name. He looked like a child throwing a tantrum in a very expensive blazer. I sat perfectly still. I watched the candle flame dance in the draft. I felt the weight of the phone in my own pocket, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. The machinery I had set in motion weeks ago was grinding forward now, indifferent to Julian's shouting. Julian suddenly stopped talking. His mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. He pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it as if it had bitten him. He looked at Arthur. He said the man at the marina, the broker, told him the vessel was being arrested. He used that word, arrested, and it sounded absurd in the middle of our dining room. He said there was a transfer of lien. He said some company called Siren Holdings had filed a notice of default and was currently at the dock with a repossession crew. My mother gasped. She dropped her fork and it clattered against the fine china, a sharp silver sound that cut through Julian's panic. She asked what a lien was. She asked why anyone would be at the dock on Christmas. Arthur's face was like stone. He looked at Julian and asked him what he had done. He asked about the bridge loan. He asked if the trust money wasn't enough to cover the initial obligations. Julian started to stammer. He said it was just a technicality. He said the markets had been slow and the first payment was a few days late, but he had been promised a grace period. He looked at me, then his eyes searching for something pity perhaps, or a witness to his victimhood. I didn't give him anything. I reached out and took the phone from his limp hand. I pressed the button for the speakerphone and set the receiver down on the table right next to the bowl of cranberry sauce. The voice of Mr. Henderson came through the speaker. It was a tired voice. It was the voice of a man who had seen 100 men like Julian lose things they couldn't afford. He sounded like he wanted to be home with his own family, but he was a professional, and he had a job to do. He asked if anyone was there. I spoke clearly. I told him my name was Vanessa Nixon and that I was the authorized representative for Siren Holdings. Julian jumped as if I had struck him. He yelled my name, his voice cracking. He asked what I was talking about. He asked what Siren Holdings had to do with me. I ignored him. I spoke to the phone. I asked Henderson to confirm the status of the vessel. Henderson said the crew was on site. He said the locks were being changed and the GPS tags were being verified. He said the vessel was officially in the custody of the note holder due to a violation of the Insecurity Clause and a failure to disclose material liabilities at the time of the loan's inception. I looked at Arthur. I told him that Julian hadn't just used the trust money for a down payment. I told him Julian had taken out a high-interest bridge loan from a private lender to cover the rest of the purchase price, and he had used the family estate, this house, as a secondary guarantee without telling anyone. He had lied on the application about his liquid assets. He had committed a technical fraud to look like a winner, and in doing so he had put a target on the vessel. The room went very cold. The wind outside seemed to scream against the glass. Arthur stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He looked at Julian, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father look at his son with something other than pride. It was a look of pure, unadulterated realization. Julian began to plead. He said he was going to fix it. He said he just needed a little more time. He turned to me, his face twisted with rage. He asked how I could do this. He asked where I got the money to buy a debt like that. He called me a traitor. He said I was stealing his dream. I looked him in the eye. I told him it wasn't a dream, it was a liability. I told him that I had spent 5 years in the city learning how to identify rot before it destroyed the whole structure. I told him that when I saw his name on the debt registry, I didn't see a brother, I saw a bad asset. I told the table that the private lender was terrified of Julian's lack of collateral. I had walked into their office with a cash offer to buy the note at a discount. I didn't use the trust money. I used the money I had earned through my own work, the money they never bothered to ask about. I was the one who held the paper now. I was the bank. And as a bank, I had determined that the borrower was a high-risk liability. My mother started to cry. It wasn't a loud cry, just a soft, rhythmic sobbing. She asked me to stop it. She said it was Christmas. She said we were a family, and that families didn't do this to each other. I looked at her and I thought about the silver she had polished, and the way she had told me my education was a waste. I told her that a family doesn't steal a daughter's future to buy a son a toy. I told her that the trust money was gone because they chose to give it away, but the yacht was being taken because I chose to take it. It was a matter of personal freedom. I was freeing myself from the burden of their expectations and freeing them from the illusion of Julian's success. The Insecurity Clause was the perfect weapon. It allowed me to move the moment I felt my investment was at risk. Julian's behavior tonight, his arrogance, his dismissal of my career, his admission that he saw me as a tugboat, was all the evidence of insecurity I needed. I spoke into the phone again. My voice was level. It was the voice of a woman who had spent a long time waiting for the right moment to speak. I told Henderson to proceed with the immediate removal of the vessel from the marina. I told him to have it towed to the dry dock in Maine as we had discussed. I told him I wanted the keys in my hand by tomorrow morning. Henderson said he understood. He said the engines were being prepped for the tow. He sounded relieved to be almost done. Julian grabbed the phone from the table. He screamed into it. He told Henderson he would sue him. He told him he would have his license. Henderson didn't even argue. He just hung up. The dial tone filled the room, a flat, mechanical drone that signaled the end of the conversation. Julian threw the receiver against the sideboard. It missed the silver and hit the wood with a dull thud. He looked at me as if he wanted to kill me. He asked why. He kept asking why. I stood up. I was taller than him in that moment, even though we were the same height. I told him it was because he thought the world was a gift, and I knew it was a series of transactions. I told him that trade school was a very respectable option for a man with his current financial standing. I used my father's own words, and they felt like stones in my mouth. I looked at the table. The turkey was cold. The wine was gone. The family I had grown up with was gone too. There was only a collection of people in an old house, staring at the ruins of a prestige that had never really existed. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I laid it on the table in front of Arthur. I told him it was a copy of the assignment of the lien and the default notice. I told him it was all legal and that any attempt to fight it would only result in a public disclosure of Julian's fraudulent loan application. I told him I was protecting the family estate by removing the vessel from the equation before the original lender could foreclose on this house. I was the one who had saved the roof over their heads, even if I had to burn Julian's boat to do it. Arthur didn't touch the envelope. He just stared at the crest on Julian's blazer. The gold thread seemed to have lost its luster. The fire in the hearth popped, throwing a shower of sparks against the screen. The room was silent now. The climax had passed, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and disappointment. I had done it. I had taken the one thing they valued more than me. I had reclaimed my agency through the cold, hard logic of the market. I looked at the clock. It was 8:12 p.m. The entire world had changed in 12 minutes. I felt a strange, hollow sense of victory. It was the kind of victory Hemingway wrote about, the kind that leaves you standing alone in the dark, but standing nonetheless. I looked at Julian one last time. He looked small. He looked like a man who had never had to fight for anything, and now that the fight had come, he didn't know how to move. I turned away from the table and walked toward the hall. My coat was waiting. The wind was still blowing and the night was just beginning. The silence that followed the dial tone was heavy and thick, like the air before a snowstorm. Arthur sat back in his chair. He looked at me, and I saw him trying to find the man he used to be, the man who gave orders and expected them to be followed. He cleared his throat. It was a dry, rasping sound. He told me that I had gone too far. He said that this was a family matter, and that families do not litigate against their own. He tried to use his fatherly authority, the kind that had kept me quiet for 28 years. He told me to call the broker back. He told me to tell Henderson it was a misunderstanding. He said he would forgive this lapse in judgment if I made it right. He spoke as if he were granting me a favor. I looked at him. I saw the fine lines around his eyes, and the way his hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles were white. I told him that authority is built on trust, and he had broken that trust when he reached into my grandfather's legacy to fund Julian's vanity. I told him that I wasn't asking for forgiveness, because I hadn't committed a crime. I told him that he, however, had violated his fiduciary duty as the trustee of my fund. I explained that under state law, a trustee cannot use the assets of a beneficiary to provide a gift or a loan to another party without express written consent. I told him the word for that was embezzlement. Arthur's face went from stone to ash. He started to protest, mentioning family loyalty and the greater good of the Nixon name. I stopped him. I told him that loyalty is a two-way street and that he had turned his back on me the moment he decided my future was less important than a 50-foot hull. I told him that if he or Julian tried to block the repossession, I would file a formal suit for the recovery of the trust assets plus damages. I said it clearly. I said it with the precision of a contract. The authority he thought he held evaporated. He was just a man in an expensive suit sitting at a table with a daughter who knew the law better than he did. Julian didn't look like a prince anymore. He looked like a man who had been caught in a lie and realized the lie was the only thing holding him up. He tried to laugh, but it was a thin, desperate sound. He told me I was being dramatic. He said he would have paid the money back. He said the boat would have made us all rich. I looked at him and felt a sudden sharp clarity. I told him that he wanted to network with the elite, but he didn't understand how the elite actually operated. I told him that the people he wanted to impress didn't buy yachts they couldn't afford on high-interest bridge loans. I told him they were the ones who owned the loans. I told him that this was his first real lesson in the world he wanted to inhabit. I told him that trade school was looking better and better for him. I said that perhaps he could learn to repair the engines he wouldn't be owning. I told him that the world didn't need more men in crest blazers who didn't know how a lien worked. It was a cold thing to say, but the room was cold, and the dinner was cold, and the heart of the family had been cold for a long time. Julian didn't have an answer. He just stared at the empty space where his dream had been. He was a loser who had been exposed, and the exposure was worse for him than the loss of the money. He looked at our mother, looking for a way out, but there was no way out. Diane began to weep then. It wasn't the kind of weeping a mother does when her children are hurting. It was a rhythmic, performative sobbing that I recognized from my childhood. She didn't cry because I was leaving. She didn't cry because Julian had lied. She cried because of the embarrassment. She said the Whitmores would find out. She said the story would be all over the club by New Year's Day. She asked how she was supposed to show her face at the bridge tournament. She spoke of the shame I was bringing on the house. I watched her, and I realized that her tears were for the image, not the reality. She cared about the optics of the yacht more than the fact that her daughter had been robbed by her own father. This was the core of the old guard philosophy that as long as the silver was polished and the dinner was served on time, the rot underneath didn't matter. I felt a sudden shift in my own heart. The need for their validation, the quiet hunger I had carried for years to be seen as an equal, simply died. It went out like a candle in a sudden gust of wind. I realized that I didn't need them to understand me or to be proud of me. I was free because I didn't value the things they valued. The American value of personal freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about being independent of the opinions of people who do not respect you. I was independent. I was the new American resilience, built on the hard reality of work and the cold logic of self-reliance. I looked at my mother and saw a woman who was trapped in a museum of her own making. I was not going to be an exhibit in that museum. I stood up from the table. The movement was slow and deliberate. I looked at my plate. I had barely touched the turkey. It sat there, a pale, dry heap of meat that looked like a mistake. I looked at the wine in my glass. It was still there, but the sparkle was gone. I told them that the dinner was over. I said it as a matter of fact. Arthur didn't look up. He was staring at the manila envelope I had placed on the table. He knew what was inside, and he knew that he couldn't win. I told him that I would be staying at a hotel tonight, and that I would be back in the morning to collect the rest of my things. I told him not to call me. I told Julian to stay away from the marina. I said that the repo crew had orders to call the police if anyone interfered with the arrest of the vessel. I walked out of the dining room and into the hall. The air there was even colder. I could hear the wind beating against the front door, a heavy rhythmic thudding. I went to the closet and pulled out my coat. It was a heavy wool coat, charcoal gray with a stiff collar. I put it on and felt the weight of it. It was a good coat. It was made to withstand a Connecticut winter. It was made for a woman who walked alone. I buttoned it all the way to the chin. I felt the fabric against my neck. It was rough and honest. I looked into the mirror in the hall. My face looked the same, but my eyes were different. They were the eyes of someone who had seen the bottom of the lake and survived. I thought about the yacht out in the dark water. I thought about the way it would look when the tow lines were attached. It would be a small, dark shape in a very large ocean. I felt a sense of peace that was as cold as the ice on the windows. I had done what I came to do. I had reclaimed my future, And I had done it with the tools they had given me, the tools of power and the tools of the law. I didn't feel like a villain, and I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a person who had finished a difficult job and was ready for the next one. The old guard was behind me, weeping for its lost image. The new world was ahead of me, waiting in the wind and the snow. I reached for the handle of the front door. The brass was frozen. I turned it and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. I walked down the stone steps toward my car. The gravel crunched under my boots. It was a solid, real sound. I didn't look back at the house. I knew what was inside, and I knew that it couldn't touch me anymore. I was a young woman in her late 20s, with a gray coat and a clear conscience. I had a long drive ahead of me, and the roads were likely to be slick, but I had good tires, and I knew how to drive in the dark. I got into the car and started the engine. The heater began to hum. I put the car in gear and drove down the long winding driveway. The lights of the house faded in the rearview mirror until they were just a faint yellow glow in the storm. I turned onto the main road and headed toward the city. The falling action was complete. The weight was gone. I was just a woman on a highway moving forward through the winter night. The road was dark, and the snow was coming down in thin, dry flakes that didn't stick to the windshield. I drove the car toward the city and felt the tires biting into the asphalt. The heater hummed, and the dashboard glowed with a soft green light. I didn't look at the clock, and I didn't look at the phone. I just looked at the road. It was a good road, and it led away from the house on the sound. The house was behind me, and the silver was behind me, and the weeping was behind me. I felt the weight of the night, and it was a clean weight. It was the weight of a thing that had been done and done well. I had taken the boat, and I had taken the pride, and I had taken the future they tried to take from me. It was a fair trade. In the world I lived in, everything was a trade. I thought about the bridge loan and the Insecurity Clause, and the way Julian's face had looked when the speakerphone went dead. It was a look that stayed with me, but it didn't hurt. It was just a fact. The fact was that Julian was a man who didn't understand the cost of things, and I was a woman who did. I drove for an hour, and the snow got heavier and the wind started to push the car, but I held the wheel steady and I didn't slow down. I was a good driver. I knew how to handle a machine in the winter. I saw a sign for an all-night diner. It was a neon sign that flickered in the dark. It was the kind of place that stayed open for the people who worked when everyone else was sleeping. I pulled the car into the lot. The gravel was deep and the car moved through it with a slow, grinding sound. I parked and turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and it was very quiet. I sat for a moment and watched the snow fall through the light of the neon sign. The sign said, "Eat," and it was red. I got out of the car and the cold hit me again. It was a sharp, honest cold. It made me feel alive and it made me feel real. I walked to the door and went inside. The diner smelled of old grease and fresh coffee and wet wool. There were a few people there. A trucker was sitting at the counter, his head down, drinking from a thick white mug. 2 nurses were in a booth, talking in low voices about the shift they had just finished. These were the people of the new America. They were the people who worked with their hands and their minds, and who didn't ask for things they hadn't earned. This was my community. I had spent 5 years in the city becoming one of them, and I felt more at home in this diner than I ever had in the house on the Sound. I sat on a stool at the end of the counter. The vinyl was cracked and cool. The waitress came over. She was an older woman with tired eyes and a steady hand. She didn't ask me about my Christmas, and she didn't ask me why I was alone. She just asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted black coffee. She brought it in a heavy mug. The coffee was hot and bitter, and it tasted exactly the way it should. I held the mug with both hands and felt the heat seep into my fingers. It was a good heat. I drank the coffee and watched the snow against the window. I thought about the American value of personal freedom. It wasn't about the yacht or the trust fund or the optics of success. It was about this. It was about being able to sit in a diner at midnight on Christmas and know that you owed no one anything. It was about having the resilience to build a life out of nothing and the strength to protect it when people tried to tear it down. I had built my life, and I had protected it. I was 28 years old, and I was free. The realization was quiet, and it was deep. It was like a river that runs underground. You don't see it, but you know it's there because the ground is solid. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a vibration that I felt through the wood. I picked it up. It was a message from Henderson. There was a photo attached. I opened the file. The photo was dark and grainy, but I could see what it was. It was the Golden Fleece. The yacht was out of the water, held in the air by a massive crane. The white hull looked small and fragile against the black sky. It looked like a toy that had been put away for the night. The cables were taut, and the water was dripping from the keel. It was a beautiful boat, but it looked wrong out of the water. It looked helpless. I looked at the photo for a long time. I thought about Julian, and I thought about the platform he wanted to build. He had built it on sand, and now the tide had come in. I felt a sense of finality. The symbol of the betrayal was grounded. The debt was being liquidated. The accounts were being balanced. I deleted the photo and put the phone back in my pocket. I didn't need to see it again. The image was burned into my mind, and it was enough. I finished the coffee. It was cold now, but it was still good. I put a $5 bill on the counter. It was more than the coffee cost, but I wanted to leave it. The waitress nodded to me and I nodded back. It was a simple exchange and it was clean. I walked out of the diner and back to the car. The snow had stopped and the clouds were breaking. I could see the stars. They were bright and cold, and they didn't care about anything that happened on the earth. I liked that about them. I got into the car and started the engine. The heater hummed and the dashboard glowed. I put the car in gear and drove out of the lot. I had nowhere I had to be, and I had everywhere I could go. The road was open and the night was clear. I felt the resilience in my hands and I felt the freedom in my chest. It was a new day, and it was a new year, and I was Vanessa Nixon. I was a woman who knew how to handle the winter. I drove south toward the city, and I didn't look back. The iceberg was mostly underwater now, and I was the one who knew where the deep water was. The engine hummed against the quiet of the highway, a steady pulse that signaled the closing of a long and bitter chapter in Vanessa's life. If you found her resilience inspiring or have thoughts on her cold calculation, please subscribe and share your story in the comments. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.